New Year's Eve had always been my favorite night of the year. The countdown, the fireworks, the collective hope that maybe the next year would be better. It all felt magical. This year, my friends decided to throw a huge party in a rented loft downtown. The place was packed with people, music blaring, drinks flowing, and laughter filling the air. But amid the chaos, one person stood out. I first noticed him leaning against the far wall, sipping something from a clear glass. He didn't look like he was part of our crowd. Dressed in a dark suit with slicked back hair and a faint smirk on his face, he exuded a calmness that felt out of place. His piercing green eyes scanned the room like he was searching for something, or someone. "Hey, do you know that guy?" I asked my friend Sarah, nodding in his direction. She squinted. "Nope. Weird though. I thought this was invite only." That should have been my first red flag. But the drinks had dulled my caution, and by the time the stranger approached me, I was too tipsy to think clearly. "Happy New Year," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "Not yet," I replied, glancing at the clock. "We still had 10 minutes until midnight." He smiled, but there was something unsettling about it, like he knew something I didn't. "Enjoy the time you have left." The way he said it sent a chill down my spine. Before I could respond, he disappeared into the crowd. I looked for him, weaving through clusters of people, but it was like he'd vanished into thin air. At midnight, everyone gathered near the windows to watch the fireworks. As the first bursts of color lit up the sky, the loft was filled with cheers and shouts of "Happy New Year!" That's when I noticed it. A faint buzzing sound, almost like static coming from the far corner of the room. "Do you hear that?" I asked Sarah. "Hear what?" But before I could explain, the lights flickered. Then, the buzzing grew louder, morphing into a high-pitched whine that made my ears ache. Panic spread through the crowd as the windows began to rattle violently. And then the room went dark. When the lights came back on, the stranger was gone. So were several other people. The doors were locked and no one could explain what had happened. The only clue was a faint sulfuric smell lingering in the air and a single word scrawled on the mirror in the bathroom: "Soon." The police arrived an hour later, but they were baffled. The missing guests were never found. Months passed and the party became a local urban legend. The New Year's disappearances. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the stranger had been warning me. In the months that followed, strange things began to happen. A shadowy figure would appear in my peripheral vision, only to vanish when I turned my head. Static interrupted my phone calls, always at the same time. 11:50 p.m. And then there were the dreams, vivid nightmares of a dark, endless void, where I could hear the stranger's voice whispering, "Enjoy the time you have left." One night, I woke up to find a note on my nightstand that hadn't been there before. It read, "Midnight is coming." I don't know what it means or why this is happening to me, but as the next New Year's Eve approaches, I'm terrified of what will happen when the clock strikes 12. It was my first New Year's Eve alone. My breakup with Emily a month earlier had left me reeling, and I wasn't in the mood for parties or forced celebrations. So I stayed home, made a small dinner, and planned to watch the countdown on TV before calling it a night. Around 11 p.m., I decided to take a walk to clear my head. The streets were quiet, blanketed in fresh snow that muffled every sound. Most people were inside, laughing, drinking, or counting down the minutes until midnight. As I turned onto the main road, I spotted him, a man standing in the middle of the street, staring up at the sky. He wasn't wearing a coat, just a thin sweater and jeans, despite the freezing temperature. "Hey, are you okay?" I called out. He didn't respond. I approached cautiously, my boots crunching in the snow. When I was close enough to see his face, I froze. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were empty, like two black holes staring back at me. "You shouldn't be out here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Without a word, he raised his arm and pointed down the street. I followed his gaze and saw nothing but an empty stretch of road. "What is it? What are you looking at?" He didn't answer. Instead, he turned and began walking away, his footsteps leaving no marks in the snow. Against my better judgment, I followed him. He led me down a narrow alley, past rows of darkened buildings, until we reached an old, abandoned house. The windows were boarded up and the door hung crooked on its hinges. The man stopped in front of the house and turned to face me. "Midnight," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What about midnight?" I asked, but he was already gone. When I checked my watch, it was 11:59. The second hand ticked slowly, agonizingly toward midnight. As it struck 12, the house erupted into flames. Silent, cold flames that didn't produce any heat. I ran, my heart pounding, and didn't stop until I was back in my apartment. The next day, I went back to the spot with the police, but there was no sign of a fire. The house was intact, as if nothing had happened. But I know what I saw, and I'll never forget the man in the snow. It was supposed to be a fresh start. After years of bad choices and broken relationships, I decided to spend New Year's Eve in the tiny cabin I'd rented in the woods. No parties, no distractions, just me, a bottle of champagne, and my thoughts. The cabin was cozy, with a small fireplace and a single window that looked out into the forest. By 11:30, I was sitting by the fire, the champagne unopened, lost in memories of the past year. That's when I heard the knock. It was soft, almost hesitant, but in the stillness of the night, it sounded like a thunderclap. I froze, my heart racing. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and I hadn't told anyone where I was staying. The knock came again, louder this time. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. Against my better judgment, I approached the door and opened it a crack. A woman stood on the porch, her hair matted with snow and her clothes torn. "Please," she said, her voice barely audible. "Let me in." She looked terrified, her eyes darting nervously into the woods. I hesitated, but the fear in her eyes was enough to convince me. I stepped aside, and she hurried in, collapsing onto the floor. "Are you okay?" "What happened?" I asked. "They're coming," she whispered, clutching her knees to her chest. "Who's coming?" Before she could answer, the lights flickered. The fire dimmed, and a cold draft swept through the cabin. The woman looked up at me, her face pale. "You shouldn't have let me in." The door burst open, and figures in dark cloaks flooded the room. They moved silently, their faces hidden, but I could feel their eyes on me. One of them reached for the woman, and she screamed, a blood-curdling sound that made my ears ring. I tried to fight them off, but they were too strong. One of them grabbed my arm, and the last thing I remember was a sharp, burning pain before everything went black. When I woke up, the cabin was empty. The woman was gone, and so were the cloaked figures. But carved into the wall above the fireplace was a single word: run.